And we are back. So for all our listeners out there, I'm so sorry that we have left you sitting, withering on the vine, constantly by your phone and your podcast app, waiting for another episode of Shameless Parenting. We have been, if you haven't noticed, on hiatus. You would realize that all the episodes and recordings that we did with between Steph and myself, literally Rory was breastfeeding, attached to her like the little barnacle he is. And honestly, it just got too much. We couldn't keep it up. We couldn't get through the records and everything. So we had to take a little break. And one of the things that was a real shame is that, all the listener questions have been piling up. So Steph and I literally have hundreds of your questions and, wanting to get in touch with us with your funny parenting stories, your relationship stories. The adults-only relationship episode was really popular as well. So we thought what we'd do today is I'd knock on the door, figuratively, of course, to one of my very old friends. And we have on the air as a guest today to help me sort through this hot mess of listener questions, Neil. So how you doing, mate?
I'm very good, mate. How are you?
Good. And, we've known each other for a very long time, and it kind of a strange one too, because we worked together in Sydney very early on in my career, and we knew each other before we were parents. And then you moved back to Ireland to kind of raise your family and to kind of grow your family there. So we've kind of had this weird relationship where we've had our identities as single or coupled up people, but without kids. And then you've left Ireland, left me in Sydney, by the way, which I'm not so happy about, and haven't been able to impart any of your fatherly wisdom on me. And we've now connected since, but we both have quite big families now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think you got to see the start of my parenting journey in Sydney, because I had my eldest, who's now 13, going on 14, while you were still partying hard. I was beginning the sleepless nights journey. So I don't know
if I ever partied hard though.
maybe it delayed your journey by a year or two when you saw the look on my face going into work after not sleeping.
Well, we have like a real selection of listener questions that we're going to plow through today, and you're going to help me kind of give a male perspective on some of these things, an Irish male perspective, I must say. I don't know that many true Irish people. I thought, being friends with you in my early 20s would kick off this chain event where I'd have a big Irish community. It didn't really happen. So, we'll see if there's any cultural differences there. Question for you before we start it all. I've already introduced that we knew each other before we were parents. How would you say that, you've changed since having kids? Like, if you had to sum up to me how the Neil that I knew back in the early days is different from Neil in 2024 after raising a family, what would you say is the other key differences?
Sleep deprivation for 14 years being primary. Yeah. The primary change and all the ravages that has on the human body and mind.
It does feel like you're slowly dying, doesn't it, sometimes?
I think it changes your world outlook. The things maybe that were of that seemed to be of significance before kids probably shift around a bit. I mean, things like owning a nice fancy car or owning nice furniture and stuff, those things get destroyed.
Oh yeah, you can't have nice things.
So, yeah, those priorities tend to drift into the background, and possibly I've become just a little bit more aware of the world in general, and thinking about kind of what's happening and what the sort of things my kids will face when they're a bit older. Thankfully, they're still pretty young.
Yeah,
but yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it? I think that when I reflect on how I've changed, and you can, once you get across all the obvious things, like you're older and you're tired and you've been through the walls of it all and still going through it, you are left with this sense of feeling like a little bit more, I wouldn't say negative, but you're more anxious because of the weight of the responsibility. You're more vulnerable. And I think that the reality is that when you're young or when you don't have kids, you have less to lose in a way. You have less skin in the game in terms of life and in terms of the world. And that's really the only way to be free in that young and free sense, that you don't actually care what happens to anything except yourself, probably, or maybe a few others, your family, or whatever it is. But now there's a direct line to your responsibilities and your kids, and you have to I kind of said to Steph, the moment that your child comes into the world, it's like it's a switch, it's a binary thing that now you never have to stop worrying about them, you never have to stop thinking about them. They're always there from that point on, to the point where you're just like, well, it happens so quickly. Well, let's come back to it, because I'm sure some of these questions are gonna spark these thoughts. I usually tackle this with Steph, and she brings a female's point of view to a lot of these things. But really, the intent around Shameless Parenting was kind of trying to represent the equality for fathers, and I think that it's an area that has made big strides, but still lacks a lot of that appreciation, and in lots of small and large ways, that actually men have progressed faster, I think, into parenting, into modern day parenting, hands-on parenting, than the culture has been able to catch up with it.
Yeah, I guess the very concept of being a man is obviously changing at a very rapid rate as well. So you have, I guess, what it is to be a man and what society expects from men changing, and then the parenting aspect and what it means to be a father changing as well. I'm not sure if the two things are changing in sync or counter cyclically or what way, but I don't think they're necessarily aligned. So you got to try and figure out a way through that.
Yeah, it's so true. I think that we're at a tipping point too, I think, with the world at the moment. And it would be remiss of me to not mention the whole Trump thing, because I think a lot of that signals a bit of a swing of the pendulum back to conservatism in a lot of ways. And one of the things that could be attached to that pendulum would be the archetype of the father, or what it means to be a man, and this idea that perhaps some of these progressive values have gone too far, or there might be a nostalgia for a time where traditionally masculine or even macho kind of techniques might start to re-emerge.
You've read The Fourth Turning, or you're probably aware of The Fourth Turning and the cycles. It does feel like things are kind of maybe moving into a new era. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of years.
And look, I think that's something to navigate. I think that the pendulum has swung too far in some aspects, where we're constantly striving and trying to adapt to new things without almost, I think, it's this kind of revolution around psychology and data-driven analysis that makes us throw away some of the old methods without doing our homework on them. Whether it be like religion, whether it be just traditions. I think that the world is so eager to disrupt things right now that we've fallen victim to some of that, and don't read into that I'm calling for spankings to be brought back or anything like that. It's more just that there are ways of doing things, and they have been successful for a long time. And while they might not be able to articulate themselves why it's important, there is something at the midst of that pile, at the bottom of that pile, rather.
There's probably a societal lag as well, in terms of society waking up to the fact that maybe things are better in a certain way. I don't know how long. Like when I started in primary school, corporal punishment was still a thing in Ireland. In some schools, not in all schools. But I have friends who were punished by teachers with a leather belt. And it's not that long. Okay, I'm old, but I'm not that old. So We've gone a very long way from that in a short period of time. And I think sometimes for society to catch on to certain facts, maybe there's a lag. So maybe it starts through people sort of realizing something isn't necessarily optimal.
Yeah, I mean, the physical punishment is a really interesting thing, because growing up as a first generation Australian, my parents are Malaysian, and they grew up, Chinese Malaysian, and they always speak about times where they got the cane, right? And our parents' generation, that was very, that was commonplace to get a rap over the knuckles or whatever it was. And then that kind of, within a generation, almost entirely disappeared from polite society. Like, were they wearing the belt and then they took the belt off and then hit? Or was it a special belt they got from the closet?
It was a special thing in the closet called, it had a name, it was called the biff.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and if you stepped out of the line, now, it was used. Now, don't get me wrong, not everybody was getting beaten every day, but it was used. And some teachers didn't use it apparently, but other teachers were reasonably fond of it.
I think it's just to kind of be a little bit absurd about it for a moment. I would probably prefer the belt to live in the closet, because I think the whole like taking off of the belt and then getting whipped with like whatever belt's on that day. Yeah, I'm not a fan of that. I think it's a bit too. That's an X factor that I don't want to gamble with. Like
the rhinestone studded Friday special.
Why did I get the punk teacher? I do know people. People that are actually my age that still spank their kids, and they have strong reasons around why they wish to do it. And of course, it's never to inflict bodily harm on the kids. It's more of a psychological state that they put the kids into, right? It's like it's almost a mental state that they put them into around punishment and discipline, or trying to connect consequences to actions and things like that. Let's move into something a bit lighter than beatings and floggings.
Than beating children.
Yeah, it's a rich topic. Let's go to the first listener question. All right. Dear podcast, I have a confession to make. It was in the early days of our first child, and my wife was still on maternity leave. Sleep was bad, to say the least, and I'll cut to it. One day, I left for work in the morning, but instead of going into the office, I booked a hotel room and called in sick. I negotiated an early check-in and slept, relaxed, ordered room service until work was over, and returned home to my family. To this day, no one knows. Am I a bad person for wanting to recharge? Wow. Just for a minute, all right? Like, I've no reason to think that... Have you ever thought about doing that?
I wish I was that smart. And I will share that with somebody who needs it at some point. It's too late for me, unfortunately. But no, I think that's a big brain idea. I would definitely not cast judgment. Now, if it became every Friday, that would be...
Why do you have gold status membership at the Intercontinental?
Mr. Fung, your regular room?
Come to the Gold Players Lounge. Well, look, to be honest, I actually have thought about this because, in those early days, you were just so desperate for like some kind of reprieve, right? You're some kind of like shelter from the storm, and all you want to do is sleep, and you just want to be by, yourself recharging. And if you work the kind of job, like a kind of corporate white collar job, then yeah, like, I mean, you could be really phoning it in some days in those early days. And I think that's something that people don't really talk about. That they always talk about the cost of women in their careers, but I think that the reality is, if you are a father that is involved, and you're a good partner, and you're contributing to the early days, your job's going to suffer, your productivity is going to suffer, your mind's going to suffer, and you'll push through it, and and people have ways of doing that. But I don't think that's quite acknowledged. And I know it wasn't when I was going through it for the first time, because the people, the characters or the other management that I met, they just didn't have any idea, because they obviously were career people that had stay-at-home wives, or they just weren't hands-on. I remember actually having this conversation with someone where I was just kind of, I don't know, I wasn't complaining, but I suppose I was saying, I'm really struggling with sleep, getting up multiple times and stuff. And it was a very senior person at the time who just said, "Why are you getting up?" And I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, well, what are you going to do about it? And it's like, and I'm like, I get up and settle and try to help. It's like, no, the mother has hormones to deal with that. That's what they're made. That's what they're made to do. Well, you shouldn't be getting up. You need to sleep. That's why she's not working. And it's like, I could see in his mind that he wasn't trying to be funny. it was just pure logic to him. He's like, she's off work. You have to work, you know, and you do not have breasts. So it was just so funny because it just showed me the difference in how things have moved on. Like if you're one of those fathers who didn't have to go through that, or weren't maybe expected to, or you had a deal at home, things were just so, your reality through that period was just so different. You know, you probably hardly broke your stride through that period.
Yeah. I mean, I still remember in the early days going into a meeting room one day after having had, you know, no sleep for a while, and sitting down, making a phone call. I had to make a phone call, and there were soft chairs in there, like, you know, they're not quite armchairs, but slightly more comfortable chairs. I made the phone call. I sat back just for a second, and the sun was coming through the window, and I fell fast asleep. Fast asleep. I don't know how long it was for. It was a glass-walled meeting room. And I remember waking up at such a start, going, crap, did anyone see that? I think I got away with it. But yeah, I mean, that's not exactly a high-performing employee right there, literally falling asleep during the day. But I guess, yeah, you battle through it, right?
Yeah. I think, you know, there's a productivity. Coming back to the question, though, this person is obviously feeling significant guilt for what's occurred, and he's even gone to the fact of asking this father whether he's a bad person, right? And I think we should probably talk to that a little bit, because on the surface, right, analytically looking at this situation, you kind of have to make peace with the fact that if you're keeping the secret and you're scared to kind of admit this to your partner, then you already have your answer that you know that is kind of wrong. But that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. I just want to put that out there. Like, both things can be true. It can be wrong for you to have hidden that, or kind of taken that leap and then hid it for so long, and now you're telling a random podcast. We love you, keep listening, but still, rather than telling your partner. And also bold to assume that your partner doesn't listen too. Maybe there might be room for cross promotion here. But don't feel. Yeah. I don't think you feel bad about it, right? Like I think that it's an extraordinary time in your life. You know, deals have to be made. Things have to be done. Like, you know what I mean? To make it through. And like you said, if it's not happening, if you're not still doing it, and the kid's like 4 or 5 or whatever, then all's fair in love and war. Seriously, like I just kind of think, move through it. Try to get to work on the communication so that you can actually tell your partner and laugh about this. I mean, after maybe getting hit with a thong.
The good Irish Catholic background in me is telling me, just confess. Get it off your chest. You'll feel a lot better.
Yeah, so true.
There'll be some momentary pain, maybe, but it might even spark a conversation about, like, just as you suggested there, Brian. You know, maybe she should do the same. Take a day and go.
And you know what? Maybe she has.
Yeah.
Maybe she
don't
has.
confess to work. Just to his partner.
Yeah. The sleep deprivation stuff is so real, right? Like, I actually remember in the early days falling asleep in like a one-on-one meeting. Can you imagine, right? Like that's like the equivalent of like, I don't even go there, but it was so bad that I could hear the words, someone's talking at me, and I could just see like the light going down. You know, like that scene in the Terminator where he's just about to die and that little red light just kind of like closes in. It was like that. All right, here we go. Dear podcast, I'm ashamed to say that more and more I've been having a real issue with my child. The thing is, he doesn't look like me. Everyone comments on it, and it's starting to really affect me. It's to the point where one of my friends even joked that I should be taking a paternity test. What should I do to move through this?
Ooh, that's quite spicy.
Many interracial couples in Ireland?
Should, like, more and more now, but I mean, traditionally we were very monocultural. Nobody wanted to come here because it was cold and we were poor. But in the last 40 years or so, obviously everything has...
then came the helicopters.
Yeah.
And the sweet tax haven.
Yeah. But, so no, in answer to your question, of course there are now, but society is changing quite fast here, and we're catching up with a lot of the social problems that other parts of the world have dealt with for a long time. They're all kind of coming to the fore now, because of the new reality of it being a place that people want to go, where there's a good standard of living. I think average GDP or average income per capita is double what it is for the US now in Ireland.
Wow.
So that makes it attractive for people looking to have a better life. So yeah, it's changing.
Yeah, I've got a theory actually. I think that when you're talking about cost of living and like quality of life, it should be judged by a coefficient of how many drones ownership there is in the population. Because I feel like that is the most reliable indicator that I have got some spare coin. I've tricked my family and myself into thinking that my life would be better by buying this drone that ultimately never gets used. So that would be a good one. Look, we don't necessarily have to think that this particular listener is talking about, because I'll admit it, where my mind goes to is like, this is a big old black baby, right? He's like he's a white guy. But it doesn't have to be like that. It could be anything. And I guess the general thing here, I suppose, is what I get to the heart of this question really is less for me about kind of like this weird thing about paternity or whatever it is. It's the idea of how important is it that our children are like us, right? Like that they look like us, they walk like us, they talk like us. And we've all fallen, I mean, I've personally fallen into that trap too, not with aesthetics so much, but even just like, you have to remind yourself that your kids aren't you, right? And like you can't expect them to behave like you and think like you. And that is something that creeps up on you, right? Like that as they get older, that you find yourself sometimes pushing against that, or you get frustrated, like, why don't you get this? Or what? Like, I would never do this. It's like, well, no, they're not you. That's the whole point. But I don't know, like when you have a question like that, how important is it for, your son or your daughter, well, I mean, for men, mostly your son, to look like you? Yeah,
I mean, I personally, all three of my children do look quite like me. So I'm probably not the best. Now, thankfully, in some aspects, and in other aspects, they don't. But none of them act like me, and they're all their own. They're all their own people. So yeah, I mean, you find some people dressing their kids in the way that they dress, and trying to make them clones of themselves, even giving them the same name. I have no judgment on that, but like a lot of people do that.
That's the whole junior thing.
But yeah, aesthetically wise, completely not important. Personality wise, that's the more interesting thing. But as you said, they're all their own people, and I guess it's a nature versus nurture type of thing as well, right? Because they're growing up in a different time to the time that we grew up in, and they're exposed to a lot of different stuff. So there's no way that they're going to be clones of us.
Yeah, look, I think that the other aspect of this is obviously, I have an interracial situation going on. So whenever that happens, you always have a heightened curiosity about what the kid's going to look like and how much of each race gets put in there. And usually the general rule of thumb or heuristic is that a drop of anything non-white is like Coke in any other soft drink. It just makes it Coke, right? But that doesn't always happen. And that can create kind of funny issues where like, some of my kids, they don't look very Chinese or Asian. And so when I'm with them out in public by myself, yeah, you do get a few more looks and a little bit of, what's this weird guy with a moustache doing with these kids that don't look like him? Should I have I think I'll just dial the 9-1 and then I'll just keep that extra one in my pocket just so I can call it really fast. In a weird way, I actually think this is why circumcision is still a thing. Because I think that actually, yeah, I'm going to jump there.
How did you get there?
Because it goes to this idea of like, so if you've been circumcised, and I'm not talking about deep religious, like Jewish reasons or whatever it is, but if you're someone who's been circumcised, you will very likely circumcise your child, your son. And I think the reason is because you want them to be, like on a deep level, you want them to be like you. You want them to like be like you, right? And I think that I'm trying to grapple with the fact that is a natural, for this listener, that is a natural thing. And I want to acknowledge that. that it's okay to want, like, I mean, we were much more honest about this in generations gone by, that actually part of the benefit or part of the reason of raising a family was to have the ability to mold and bring your kids up in the way you wanted to. And it was totally your responsibility, but also totally your choice on how to raise your kids. And I feel like we've lost a little bit of that nowadays in this progressive modern parenting. Almost to the point where actually, like, the parents sometimes can't challenge the institutions and the elites on the subject of what the orthodoxy is of raising a kid, right?
And also there's a cutoff to raising of, I think it's, well, in Ireland, I think it's 16, but some stuff kicks in from about 14. So basically from 16 years of age, as a parent, you don't have any right to medical information or other things relating to the child if they don't want to share it, which can lead to a lot of it can lead to difficulties that parents aren't aware of for older kids, older teens. But yeah, so society is kind of imposing upper limits on parenting as well.
Yeah, and I think that I have a little bit of a problem with that at a conceptual level. I understand, and I'm not one of these people who don't believe in the elites or the people whose job it is to educate and research these developmental and social kind of policies. But I do think at the end of the day, the buck stops with the parents, right? And so if that's really the case, like a lot of things, you have to give them the choice, right? You need to give them the authority and the mandate. And it's always tenuous with kids, right? You can't put the parents in a situation where they're challenging it, because you see that all the time, where then now there's this push and pull between, oh no, I expect the school or the state to do these things or to educate and protect my kids or whatever. But then again, you also cry poor about not being able to control the conditions of your child's upbringing. So I think that this is a balance that we need to work out. Now,
there can be some unintended consequences. I think the people who come up with these rules, I personally feel their heart's often in the right place. They're doing it because of ultimately they want to try and benefit the child. So there may be some circumstances where, a 15 or 16 year old needs to be able to keep things from, I guess, bad parents or malparenting, but there can be unintended consequences where things are happening that then a parent, like anecdotally, I've heard where a child may be identified that they need some sort of counselling in school, a teenager, and they're directly referred to somebody to provide that counselling without the parents being aware of it. Yeah. The school can't tell the parents. So there can be unintended consequences sometimes.
Yeah, I think so. All right, let's put a little bow on that one. This one's really interesting, and I think that based on the age of the spread of the kids for us, this one will be quite interesting to you. So, dear podcast, I'm a father of 3, all teenagers. I live in Sydney, and we've just had an announcement on the banning of social media sites for those 16 and younger. This, honestly, is music to my ears due to all the pressures that my girls face when it comes to social media. I had no idea what they were getting themselves into, but even getting a taste of what happens to them on group chats, Snapchats, and all the online bullying just makes me lose hope. Funnily enough, most of the other fathers in my group are totally against the ban. They feel that it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that it is another way that Australia is turning into a nanny state. Kids need to be able to deal with emerging technology. I understand. I feel very passionate and violently conflicted with my friends. What do you think?
One of the challenges of our times, and a very rich vein for conversation from certainly from my perspective. I have quite strong views on this, which are probably not necessarily aligned with the mainstream, but Has that ban come into effect? I've heard it in the news, obviously. Yeah,
it has been announced, but the details of exactly how it's going to be enforced and all that kind of business, it's still being worked through. But it looks like, 16 and under, there will be some kind of proof required age gating for social media sites. So things like obviously the major ones, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, but even things like Discord, so the chatting sites, and also YouTube, which was a little bit surprising to me because I've always felt like YouTube was somewhat in between those worlds in a lot of ways. And talking to a few of the fathers that I know, I think YouTube is usually where you get the strongest pushback against the ban, because there is a feeling that it's no different to the idiot box or TV when we were growing up, and in fact, some ways it's slightly better because you can access information in a broader sense. But yeah, I'm very conflicted conceptually about the ban because it's not in my nature to support bans in this way. I think that we as a species we need to find a way through it as a society and deal with the reality that's in front of us.
Yeah.
But as a parent, practically, I totally get it. And part of me is like, oh, thank God. Thank God someone took they took the bullets off the shelf where the guns were laying around. But,
I don't know. Like I definitely have some libertarian tendencies. I wouldn't go so far as to call myself a libertarian. I have some tendencies, but like from my perspective, I see this primarily as a parenting issue. I guess the problem is what happens when you're outside of the home. So like from our decision, myself and my wife, our decision has been that our children, while they're children, they don't have phones. So my son went into secondary school last year, and when he was in the final year of high school, which is called sixth class here, he had a dumb phone, a 2G phone that he could call and text us, because he's going to school by himself on his bike. So if anything happened, he could call or send us an SMS. He was asking for a smartphone, but we said no. We said when he start secondary school. So when he started secondary school, then we waited. The term starts in September, and we waited until the new year. So we waited until January when he got his first smartphone. But as far as you can, because he's smart, and I'm sure you can try and work out ways around it, but we have it as locked down as much as possible. The only social media he has on it would be WhatsApp. And actually that's not true, because he also has Snap, because all of his friends are on Snapchat. Yeah. And that's how they communicate. So he doesn't have, now he does have YouTube as well.
Do you consider YouTube social media?
I hadn't, but now he has YouTube. I have all of the restrictions that YouTube allow you. It's not YouTube Kids, it's YouTube. But I've tried to prevent, all the settings that allows you to lock it down as much as you can. But he's smart, so I'm sure he's capable of getting around it. But he's not on TikTok. He's not on Instagram. He's not on Facebook. Well, no kid would be on Facebook, let's face it. But he's not on any of those other platforms. And he actually hasn't asked either. He was asking for Snap, and we thought about it, and we gave it to him. I primarily see this as a parenting issue. The primary school, so my younger kids who are in primary school, several of their primary schools have written to us over the last year or two saying that they're considering a voluntary ban in the school on smartphones. This is for primary aged children now. And like that, a lot of parents, I think, are like, "Oh, great! That would make it so much better if the school banned them or had some sort of code." But I mean, myself and Barb's view is, you should be able to make that decision yourself. So what if their classmate has it? It's a tough conversation. You just say you're not getting one. It's not good for you, and you only have to have a cursory look at the level of anxiety, depression, self-harm, etc. that's happening with teenagers. I don't know what the stats are for Australia, but in Ireland and in Europe, they're skyrocketing, absolutely skyrocketing across the board. And I haven't charted it directly, but I'm sure if you look at smartphone ownership and chart it against the age and chart the levels of incidences of people requiring treatment, I'm sure the two things are very closely aligned. They have to be related.
It's brutal, actually, like when you do look at it. And I think it's probably just a maturity thing too. You know, we have to be honest with ourselves. Even adults, like, we are addicted to our phones, right? You know, and the more stressed.
I know, my kids are always telling me.
Yeah. Me too. And the worst thing is that work has become a form of weird social media as well. It's like sometimes I get this weird Black Mirror moment where I'm about to tear the walls of reality of the Matrix down when I'm at work, because I'm putting a thumbs up, I'm liking a post, or I'm like doing something in a weird perverted sense of social media, but I'm actually working in a corporate, and I'm like, how did even business get infiltrated with this social media mentality, right? Like anyway, it's very surreal. But I do think that it raises real challenges purely because of the social contagion aspect. Like I think that it's totally appropriate when the kids are young. But if we're honest with ourselves, the problem is that as a parent, your arc of control changes so violently as the kids get older, right? And you have to hope that you have laid down good foundations and you're able to make that turn with them as they start to go into, you know, young adulthood. The reality is that their identity and their peer group becomes way more important, or maybe overly weighted compared to your influence during those periods. And that's what also makes it very, very hard to control the usage. It's a big difference between saying to your, I don't know, your primary school age kid, no phone, suck it up, compared to your teenage daughter who's, you know, 15 years old.
Yeah, there are definitely, like, I have some friends who have kids who are just coming to the end of primary school, and they're saying to me they're not going to let their kids have phones till they're 15 or 16. And in my head, I'm going, good luck with that.
Yeah, that's tough.
Because the problem is they will, if they follow through, and I won't say this to them because it's not, well, they're not that good a friend that I could just lay it on the line, but the problem is their kids will find themselves excluded from a lot of what is social interaction for their peer groups now, because that's how they, like, I see my kids are all swimmers. They go to galas, swimming galas, and for the teenagers, they all sit together, they chat, it's great while they're waiting for their swims. But they're also on their phones at the same time, and they're all chatting amongst themselves. They're all at the gala, they're all chatting to each other, but they're on their phones, but they are chatting to each other while they're there. So it's almost,
it's like this augmented social thing, right?
It is,
like
100%.
But I think that what people don't realize too, or maybe we're going back to this whole thing about elites making policy and so on, is that how social we are and how social teenagers are. Like, I mean, they did this famous experiment a long time ago where they had these, I think they were chimpanzees or bonobos. I think they're chimps. Anyway, they had this one community of chimps where they had figured out the way to essentially open this type of fruit that was very challenging, and they had to use different tools, to almost like a chisel, to open it rather than smashing it over the ground. They actually found out that they could use this chisel to pry it open and use like a leverage to open the coconut or whatever this fruit was. And they passed that knowledge through the whole society of the chimps, of this one society. And then they took that chimp who had that knowledge and had demonstrated that they were able to pry open the fruit, and they put them into a brand new community of chimps who didn't know how to do that. And instead of that chimp showing the new community how to pry open the coconut thing, it just started smashing the coconut again. And the conclusion of this experiment, like, and they replicated it a few times, was it's more important to primates or to humans to fit in than it is to be actually right.
Yeah.
You know, it's actually, and it's more important to be accepted in a community. It is more important for your survival, it's more important to your well-being than to be right and to be the smartest person in the room and then, you know, be some kind of, you know, somewhat a pariah, you know? So I think that is...
You can feel better about... You can feel better about yourself the next time you're liking that social media post and work. You are the chimp with the screwdriver. Or with
that's a good analogy. I'm the chimp just banging the coconut on the ground, hoping that I'm going to get a sweet release. I don't think posting monkeys is too hot right now.
I know every year smartphone ownership is getting younger. And I think the figures are now sort of like 30 or 40% of 8 and 9 year olds have smartphones,
Wow.
which from my perspective is insane, but for a lot of people it's kind of normal, you know.
Yeah. And look, there are many good things about obviously smartphones and access to this information. But like anything, it's just, are we confident we can self-regulate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something linked but sort of tangential is, I guess, the growth of AI. You couldn't do a podcast without saying AI, right?
Thank you. It just hit our search criteria. We're now past the...
But very briefly, I think the fact that I think a large number of people are probably going to get fairly highly addicted to chatting to AI agents, having conversations with them, and that unlocks a new level of parenting fear for me. I'd certainly have that in the same. I'd actually place that above social media in terms of how concerned I will be about the use of that technology by children going forward. It's obviously newer, but that's
such an interesting... It's an interesting thought experiment, though. So say if we fast forward and our kids, like, so back in the day, you know, say you find out your kids are chatting to someone, and it's like you find out it's Julio who's, you know, 30 years old and whatever. You're like, well, you're not talking to Julio ever again or whatever. But imagine if they're just talking to an AI entity, right? And they literally just exist as an AI entity, and there are many of them, and they're kind of autonomous. Like, what's your stance on it? What would you allow, and how would you kind of position
like
it?
me personally?
Yeah.
Yeah, my stance would be like I personally have chat GPT, etc. and blocked. I try and block it. I don't want them talking to it at all. I don't see any possible good. I mean, the tool itself is obviously incredibly useful, and as an adult, it's up there. My most used apps will be YouTube, will be very close to the top for anything. Chat GPT is definitely getting up there in terms of being able to access stuff fast. I know all the limitations it has and stuff, but in terms of children using it, I don't think they should be using it. I personally don't think they should be using it at all. There's no need.
Yeah. It's a whole nother episode, isn't it? Just like how
yeah, it is.
AI
I'm sorry, Ryan. I don't want to pull you down some kind of technology rabbit hole. Like anything around technology. I'm a bit of so I've studied programming and I have worked in technical kind of jobs over the years. Anything I've read about technology in the classroom seems to have been pushed primarily by technology companies. And if you look at, and they have research to back up how useful it is, but if you actually look at people who are not related to the field, who've just done research, the more technology there seems to be in classrooms, the less well that pupils seem to do. And I would certainly find myself more in the camp of having just focusing on basic sort of education. The programming, everything else can come. I mean, and fine, if people want to do Coder Jojo with their kids and teach them the code, I think that's great. But you shouldn't be necessarily using that technology to learn, you know, English or to learn math or whatever.
Yeah. All right. Let's move into another question. Dear podcast, all my dad friends are so happy to be fathers. They seem so full of gratitude and contentment. It actually makes me feel so guilty that I don't. My life objectively is worse at the moment. No time to myself. My wife gives me zero attention. And I honestly feel like maybe I'm just not cut out for this kind of thing. I don't even have mates that I can talk to about this without coming across like a dropkick. He's definitely Australian. He's used the word. No one else uses the word dropkick. What do you think I should do to get helped? What do you think I should do to help get through this period? Wow, heavy question. And, you know, it's definitely a theme that we've spoken about a lot on this show, that when you have these helpless or negative feelings as a man, as a father, there's not a clear outlet for it. And it can be very, very hard. And what ends up happening is the internalizing of the guilt. But I'll throw it to you. What's your feeling from that question?
It sounds like this particular guy could do it talking to somebody. So maybe, I don't know. Did he say he has friends who are parents?
Yeah, he's obviously got a community, his friends that are fathers, but they're loving it. They're loving life. They've made it their identity, and he can't seem to get there.
Yeah. That's a trait. I think it sounds like he could do a little bit of support. I'm not sure exactly. Like, probably getting back to what you were kind of saying earlier around, there are mothers groups. There are groups that help mothers get through sort of parenting and for the start of it. I don't know if those groups exist for fathers. I suspect not, but maybe somebody will correct that. But it sounds like this person needs a bit of support just to kind of get through, and maybe they're not getting it from their friends. You know yourself, friends can be great in some areas and not so great in other areas. So if it's not coming from his peer group, maybe an external group would provide something that would be more aligned. I mean,
yeah,
parenting is not a bundle of joy for a lot of people. Let's face it. I guess women can go through terrible postnatal depression and stuff. Guys obviously don't have that chemical imbalance going, but there can be an awful lot of sleep deprivation and the things that come with that. And then, depending on how your home life is going and other things, it can be tough for people. Yeah, I don't. Are you aware of any groups or any kind of supports that are out there?
Look, there's definitely not as well managed as mothers groups because of the natural, cycle of it all, that they capture you as you go through the health system, and they assign you community-led support for mothers groups, and they can do that really easily, and it's very mobilized and built into that model of care. So I'm aware that there are some varying degrees of how they support. I even know of a DILF club that has different chapters around the place. So that's something that I'm not sure this particular listener is ready for just yet, but maybe in the future.
What?
A DILF club? Have you heard of a MILF?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I've never searched DILF before.
Please don't, because your AI is not going to like you. You have broken community guidelines, and we cannot generate that picture for you. In all seriousness, no, yeah, I think it's harder. It's definitely a lot harder to find a community as a man, and just in general, let's even taking the fatherhood thing out of it, right? Not all men are very good at seeking community. I put myself in that category as well. That I think that women tend to be just a little bit better at creating kind of community, and better at creating a wider circle of acquaintances where there's a feeding pool of people that you can tap on the shoulder. I think for men, what I've seen is that you have very close people, but it's kind of shallow. It's very shallow, and once you lose, for whatever reason, those close people, there's nothing to fill their gap, right? It's just So I do find that
there can be a little societal thing. It's obvious, but there can be a little societal thing of you just have to man up, like. That still exists, even though society is changing a bit. Like, there's still those attitudes,
Absolutely, and how can you complain when everyone else is so? So I get the question. I totally get it. What's going through my head, Neil, is what does this person want to hear, and what should they actually hear, right? And I think what they want to begin with, which is warranted, is acknowledgement, right? And it is hard. And I'm not going to try to argue with you. Your life is probably objectively worse right now in terms of the time that you get to yourself, all the hedonistic pleasures that used to be there for when you didn't have responsibility. And I guess that what I started talking about at the beginning of the episode, this is it, right? This is this idea that when you have less responsibilities, you are freer. This is the ultimate Buddhist thing. Pain comes from attachment, right? The suffering comes from attachment, and that is true. If you don't have any attachment, you have nothing to lose, right? You truly are free, right? But it means you also have nothing. You can't have anything, right? And then on the other end of the scale, I'm a firm believer in that your life only has meaning if you have responsibility. If you have no responsibility, your life lacks meaning, even though you're free. So I think you got to make peace with that intersection in your life, right? Like you've traded some of your freedom for responsibility, but what comes with that, and maybe you just need to try to get there mentally, is meaning, is the fact that you are now super important, right? Whether you feel like you're getting that attention or not from your wife or whatever. And there's a lag with young kids because they're attached to mum. You're not getting much from them. They're not telling you, oh, Dad, you're amazing. Look how strong you are.
Now, my kids spend most of the time telling me how bad I am.
Yeah.
It's actually the exact opposite of that.
It's brutal. And I remember like with my first daughter, she was so attached to mum that I remember like she would rarely give me affection in the early days. It's totally different now. And I remember one time she finally did, and she held my hand. I was like, oh, my heart was melting. And then what she was actually doing is she was holding my hand to walk me out of the room that the mother was in, and then close the door behind me.
Classic.
It was so good. It was such a like. It's the hope that kills you. But
you see where you fit into this.
Yeah, you know your place. But why I bring that up in terms of this question is that changes. You got to hang on, right? That ship comes around, and you're feeling all the things that make it easier to feel meaning from your responsibility or / burden or whatever it is are coming. Just hang in there, because those Hollywood expectations of opening the door, coming back from work, and the daddy running through the door, that's coming, right?
Yeah.
You obviously, the newborn can't do that. And it might look, your toddler might not do that, but that's eventually is coming in, and you have to kind of keep the faith in that way.
Yeah, you have to be present. I mean, it's kind of like the number one. It's almost like the number one parenting rule is just turn up, be present.
Yeah, there was a Simpsons quote, isn't it? Like that, it says that. Well, I think it was Homer's dad who was saying that 95% of being a parent is just being there. Yeah, and like that at the time, I probably didn't appreciate that as much. But what he really means is being, like you said, present, like in all senses of the word.
And obviously, in modern life, where you have, in a lot of cases, both parents working, even that can be a challenge, right? But yeah, I mean, being present also means when you're present, not having your phone, actually being mentally present, not just there in body.
What I want to tap into just before we leave this question is something that comes up at the fringe of questions. It's like I have a lot of listener questions that almost get to this point, but they just stop shy of actually asking it or articulating it. So I'm going to have a go. And I guess it's this balance between, all right, this listener is feeling like his life sucks. And he's even hinting, and I think this is probably what we're reacting to, where maybe he needs help, is that maybe I'm not cut out for this. Because that kind of sounds like the words of someone who's about to give up, right? Who's about to kind of give up. And that's serious. That has real life consequences. And I would say to you that, to this listener, if they're listening, and hopefully they will, there are some things that once you step over that precipice are very, very hard to repair for your family. So I would just kind of say that just kind of dwell on that for a second, that, it's a very serious thing to say. And some of these things you got to work through before damage is done, that can be very, very hard to repair. Now, what I'm trying to articulate, I guess, is this idea of, from a man or from a father's point of view, on one end of the scale, you've got the masculine patriarchy, you've got all the societal and gender norm pressures of, like you said, just man the fuck up, get it done, and muscle through it. And therefore you press all these emotions, you find a way through, and you might do it, or you might go down in flames. And then on the other end, you've got the modern, progressive, hyper-communicative kind of male who talks and wants to drag their partner into talking about their feelings, and doesn't shy away from talking about negative feelings as they arise to work through them, right? Or even just kind of communicate them. And there's a balance here that actually there's a mixed messages going to men, I think, nowadays, where it's people are saying you need to get up that end where you talk, you have better EQ, you talk about your problems, you communicate better, because that's when things go wrong, when you don't communicate. But at the same time, I know a lot of men who, once they cross that boundary, they step over that line, their partners or even society feels like they've almost broken the contract, that actually they've dumped their emotional baggage on someone, right? And they've made it their problem. And now they're no longer in that role of, security and being, a rock for the family and all this kind of thing. So what's your take on that? Like where do you see that line, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because you kind of, I guess there's expectations that you'll wear both hats, as you said. I don't know. I guess it requires a degree of self-awareness to know when maybe you're dumping too much on somebody. But I don't know. Maybe it's just a quiet word sometimes is better than, getting too far into it. Or maybe the fact that something is broached at all or raised as a kind of an idea. It's a tricky one because it jars with the more deep-seated societal expectations of roles versus the more modern feelings of how men should be. Yeah.
And do you have any credence? Like, what kind of credence do you give to this old school method of when you're feeling like this, having a drink with the boys, letting it vent through there, and then getting back to it?
Look, I'm Irish, so having a drink with the boys is always it's always an option. I don't know. A drink with the boys does feel good. It certainly doesn't hurt. But if this particular listener is going for a drink with the boys he's already identified as everything is rosy and they don't really
boys.
care. Yeah, maybe don't drink with those boys. Maybe go out with somebody else. Yeah, that works. Especially sport works as well. Going for a run, going for a cycle, something like that. That's always helps reset. They're obvious things. But yeah, no, I think going for a drink with the boys is important. I don't do it that often. Most parents I know don't do it that often, but you do vent on a different level. It's definitely different than talking to your partner.
Yeah. And I think it's because of that emotional baggage, right? And dumping it. You don't have that same fear for the guys.
Yeah.
You've just reminded me though, Neil, that I have literally dozens of questions around health and fitness that I've been keeping for you as well at another time because, I want to make me feel bad. Anyway, let's, last question of the night. And this is where we're going to move into a slightly more saucy relationship question, which I've kind of helped, had ChatGPT help me categorize. And so here we go. Dear podcasts, strap in. My wife and I have not really had the chance to be intimate for, I don't know, the last 5 years due to kids and co-sleeping. And to be honest, while it's been tough, I've kind of adapted into the new norm. Plus, I guess I'm 5 years older as well. All of a sudden, though, my wife has started to become very adventurous. ... We're talking wanting me to go downtown, something that I'm ashamed to say I never did. And now, even the introduction of what I feel are quite intimidating toys for a man to deal with, if you know what I mean. How do I put the brakes on without offending her or ruining what is potentially a thing I've always wished for?
Spicy for the second time.
Wow. Do you think, just getting meta for a sense, right? Like, I think that the type of person, I have trouble believing, even though like I've literally received hundreds of these listener questions, I do sometimes have trouble believing that when someone shares this kind of level of intimacy with a show, that they haven't, number one, done it before, and number two, that they like this is part of what they like about it. The kind of putting that out there and watching it burn. I don't know. Anyway, we should kind of treat it as it is, take it as it is.
Yeah, it's one of the trickier aspects, I guess, as you have young kids, that though trying to make sure that you have time between the pair of you gets more and more difficult. You need to, I think, like broadly speaking, you need to make time for each other. When you've got screaming babies in the house and neither of you have slept, and it can be very hard to change gears into something else. So
the transmission is broken.
Transmission is missing. There's a hole in the floor where the shifter used to be.
See, we've gone from one listener who can't seem to express their feelings to another listener who's expressed way too much. And look, I think like the first part of his his question is, I think there's a general understanding about the dynamics at play here. You can even get very, market driven about this, like supply and demand. Like this is just it's a tough time. It's a recession, and that's natural. And certain things happen at times of recession. But what's more interesting to me, like, so sorry to say that there's nothing new there, and everyone experiences a version of that if they're honest with themselves, and that doesn't necessarily mean there is anything wrong with the situation or whatever like that. Like, so I would totally want to assure people listening or this reader that like that's fine, and you have to adapt and have to be sensitive. What I do think is worth exploring is two things. One is the adaptation that he's talking about, and I do think that this can be challenging for both men and women. This idea of like you've lost something in your relationship, you've lost a level of intimacy or connection, but you both kind of have settled into it, and you kind of. And then it starts playing tricks on the couple where, sometimes you're like, why aren't we those people anymore? Or I'm almost like, oh, let's take sex out of it because it's awkward. You say like you're staying at home on a Friday night instead of going out and doing something interesting. And that's what you want to do. You want to just relax and be hedonistic. But then somehow you're ashamed, you're kind of angry at yourself for not being more adventurous like you used to be. So I think that is like a good example to contextualize what's happening here without all the awkwardness of sexy time. It's like, it's like a kind of nostalgia for what you were, but you no longer in some ways, right? Like that's not what you want to do now. And I think that is an interesting concept to explore with each other and just try to be honest around trying to get back and having baby steps. Like you don't just pull it out, you don't just pull the skateboard out of the closet that you haven't ridden for since you were a teenager and hope you can ollie down those stairs again. Like you're gonna snap your shit up. So I think I think that's worth saying to this listener that's totally cool. Now the other interesting thing I would say is this weird turn in the question where all of a sudden the wife has gone through some kind of period of like liberation or something that's happening, and like there's a whole range of reasons why that could be happening, and he's not there yet. And I do think this is a piece around communication in the trickiest of circumstances, but also like the most crucial as well, because if you are in a drought and then this happens and there's like rejection, oh man, like you get, this is a sensitive situation. If there ever was one. People's
feelings could definitely get badly hurt because you're pretty much putting yourself out there in those situations.
Yeah. It's so much about relationships it's like the timing of meeting each other, right? And of course, like we don't have the full subtext here, so quite intimidating toys for a man. I have my version of what that means, and maybe other people do. But like Robert Downey Jr. said, you can't spell subtext without butt sex, I think is the quote. So he's a very clever man, and I think maybe we should just leave it there. All right, my man, thank you so much for hanging in there with all these questions.
This has been brilliant. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, and we've got so many more. Like I said, there's a whole thing around health and fitness, and I know for all our listeners there, Neil is like an eternal Iron Man.
That's.
He's like, lie. No, it's not a lie. It's actually, it's kind of like, and it was really weird because I always thought like Irish people were kind of unhealthy and like from all the drinking and stuff. But you've obviously proven me otherwise. It's like a party hard, like work hard situation.
I can tell you the young Irish people are the Irish pub is dying because the young Irish people aren't going there.
Like the old man boozers?
In many cases. Yeah, a lot of people are still drinking, but yeah, there's definitely there's much more of an awareness of it. In my case, though, exercise really was something that it was a habit I picked up in Australia, and a good habit. That and good coffee.
Yeah.
And they both of those things have come back here. you can get a good flat white in a rural beach in the middle of winter from a guy in a caravan there, and you only have to go outside on a Sunday morning to see everybody exercising and getting out there.
What I would say to our listeners, imagine the analogy I use for Neil is like, you're like the prosumer athlete, right? You're like the closest you can get to like a pro level without actually being a pro. You're like it's like prosumer culture. you're like way above what is necessary for the average person, but just, you're still prosumer.
Thanks for that.
All right, man. Let's pick it up next time.